Throughout the galaxy, there exists one universal truth that every civilized species learns before they take their first steps into the void. Never, under any circumstances, find yourself trapped with a human when escape becomes necessary. It's not because humans are weak. It's not because they panic or freeze in dangerous situations. It's because when a human calmly raises their hand in the middle of a life-or-death briefing and asks which type, referring to the 17 different categories of deadly predators hunting you, you suddenly realize that your impossible survival situation is just Tuesday afternoon for them. The Galactic Survival Institute had been training elite operatives for over 3,000 years. They had perfected escape protocols for every known danger in the universe. They had protocols for escaping black holes, time loops, dimension rifts, and even the legendary void wraiths of the Andromeda sector. But they had never, not once in their entire history, had a student interrupt the emergency briefing to ask for clarification on predator subspecies while 17 different types of apex hunters were actively closing in on their position. Most species would consider this situation a death sentence. The human considered it an educational opportunity. What the other students didn't know, what the instructors themselves were about to discover, was that humans didn't just survive impossible situations. They collected them. They studied them. They turned them into teaching moments for the next poor soul who thought they understood what dangerous actually meant. The galaxy was about to learn why Earth's unofficial motto was "Hold my beverage" and "Watch this." The emergency klaxon screamed through the Galactic Survival Institute's training facility as Marcus Chun finished adjusting his equipment harness for the third time. Around him, his fellow trainees from across the galaxy displayed varying degrees of panic, determination, and what could only be described as religious preparation for the afterlife. The Zephyrian to his left was muttering prayers in 7 different languages while methodically checking each piece of gear with the precision of someone who expected to die, but refused to do so unprepared. The crystalline Vorthan was shifting through color spectrums so rapidly it looked like a living rainbow having a seizure. Even the normally unflappable Karath, whose species was legendary for their calm under pressure, was nervously clicking their mandibles in a staccato rhythm that suggested serious anxiety. Marcus found their collective terror somewhat puzzling. Sure, the situation wasn't ideal, but it wasn't exactly unprecedented either. At least, not from his perspective. Instructor Vexhai stood at the front of the briefing room, her scaled hide shifting to the deep crimson that indicated extreme stress among her species. She had been running survival courses for over 2 centuries, had personally survived encounters with some of the galaxy's most dangerous creatures, and had trained thousands of operatives who went on to successful careers in the most hazardous sectors of civilized space. None of that experience had prepared her for teaching humans. Listen carefully, she began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. What you are about to face is not a simulation. The Hegemony Council has classified this as a Level 7 survival scenario. For reference, only 12 operatives in the entire history of this institute have survived a Level 7 scenario. 3 of those were later classified as statistical anomalies due to extraordinary circumstances. The Zephyrian's prayers grew louder. The Vorthan's color cycling accelerated. The Karath began what appeared to be a mating call, which Marcus's cultural database helpfully informed him was actually their species' way of saying goodbye to their ancestors. Marcus raised his hand. Instructor Vexhai paused mid-sentence, clearly not expecting questions at this point in the briefing. Yes, Trainee Chun. When you say Level 7, are we talking about the old classification system or the new one? Because the old system only went to Level 10, but the new system goes to Level 15, so the relative danger index is completely different depending on which scale we're using. The room fell silent except for the continuing alarm klaxons. Every eye, sensor, and optical organ in the room turned to stare at the human, who was apparently treating their impending doom as a matter of academic classification. The old system, Vexhai replied slowly. We haven't updated our classifications since the hegemony restructure. Ah, Okay, so we're looking at approximately 70% fatality rate with standard protocols. That's not too bad. What's the primary threat vector? Vexai's hide shifted to a deeper shade of crimson. In her centuries of instruction, she had never had a student respond to a level 7 scenario by asking for statistical analysis. Most species required extensive psychological counseling just to handle level 3 scenarios. The primary threat vector, she said carefully, is predation. You will be deployed to Kepler 438b, a death world that serves as a natural preserve for some of the galaxy's most dangerous apex predators. The preserve contains 17 distinct species of predatory creatures, each of which has been known to hunt and kill trained operatives. Marcus nodded thoughtfully and raised his hand again. Which type? The silence that followed was so profound that even the alarm klaxons seemed muted. Instructor Vexai blinked slowly, her reptilian features displaying the kind of confusion typically reserved for mathematical paradoxes. I'm sorry, could you clarify your question? Which type of predators? I mean, you said 17 species, but that could cover a lot of ground. Are we talking about ambush predators, pursuit predators, pack hunters, solo hunters, aerial predators, aquatic predators, subterranean predators, energy-based life forms, silicon-based life forms, hive minds, parasitic entities, shapeshifters, phase hunters, psychic predators, temporal displacement hunters, or interdimensional infiltrators? Because the survival strategies are completely different depending on the classification. The Kara stopped making their goodbye noise. The Vorthan's color cycling slowed to a confused orange-purple blend. The Zephyrian's prayers trailed off into uncertain muttering. Instructor Vexai stared at the human for a long moment before consulting her datapad with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that either her equipment was malfunctioning or reality itself had developed a significant error. "How?" she asked slowly. "Do you know about temporal displacement hunters? That information is classified at level 12 clearance. You're a level 3 trainee." Marcus shrugged. "I grew up on Earth. We got most of those in our backyard. Well, except for the interdimensional ones. Those only show up on weekends and holidays, and usually only in rural areas." The briefing room erupted into chaos as every non-human in the room began talking, chittering, or producing whatever sounds their species made when confronted with information that fundamentally challenged their understanding of the universe. Silence. Vexai's voice cut through the noise like a plasma blade. "Trainee Chun, are you suggesting that Earth contains creatures equivalent to the galaxy's most dangerous predatory species?" "Oh, not equivalent," Marcus replied cheerfully. "Most of our stuff is worse. But you learn to work around it. It's really just a matter of understanding behavioral patterns and environmental adaptation. Plus, humans are pretty good at the whole improvisation thing." The Zephyrian leaned over and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Is he saying that his home planet is more dangerous than a level 7 death world?" Marcus considered this. "Well, I mean, we call a home, so that's probably not a fair comparison. It's like asking someone if their house is dangerous. Sure, the electrical system might kill you if you're not careful, and there's that problem with the foundation settling, and the gas line has that weird leak we keep meaning to fix, and sometimes bears get into the garbage, but you know where everything is and how to avoid the dangerous bits." "Bears?" the Vorthan asked, their crystalline form shifting to a curious blue. "Big furry omnivores with claws and teeth. They can run about 30 miles per hour, and they weigh anywhere from 200 to 1,500 pounds, depending on the species. Mostly they leave you alone unless you bother them or get between them and food. Pretty standard predator behavior, really. And these bears just live near your dwellings?" "Well, yeah. I mean, we try to keep them out of the actual cities, but if you live in the suburbs or rural areas, you're going to see them occasionally. Last year, one got into my neighbor's pool. Made a mess of the pool filter, but it seemed to enjoy itself." Instructor Vexai was rapidly scrolling through her datapad, pulling up files that Marcus's security clearance should not have allowed him to access. What she found there made her hide shift to a pale yellow that indicated either extreme confusion or the onset of a nervous breakdown. According to this data, Earth is classified as a Class 12 death world with a hazard rating that exceeds our testing parameters. How is this possible? How does your species even survive? Oh, that's easy, Marcus said, with a reason it's dangerous. The room fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of predators who had suddenly realized they weren't at the top of the food chain. Could you elaborate on that? Vexai asked in the tone of someone who wasn't entirely sure she wanted to hear the answer. Well, see, most of Earth's really dangerous stuff evolved in response to humans. We've been there for a few 100,000 years, and we're kind of competitive. So everything else had to get better just to keep up. It's like an arms race, except it's been going on for geological ages, and everybody's really good at it now. The Karath made a sound that Marcus's translation software couldn't properly interpret, but which seemed to convey existential dread mixed with professional interest. But if your planet is so dangerous, the Zephyrian asked, how do you manage to leave it? How are you not constantly fighting for survival? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. Fighting for survival? I mean, sure, you have to pay attention, but it's not like it's constant combat. Most of the time, you just need to understand what you're dealing with and plan accordingly. Like if you're going camping, you research the local wildlife, bring appropriate gear, store your food properly, and don't do anything stupid. If you're going swimming, you check for riptides, jellyfish, sharks, and brain-eating amoebas. If you're hiking, you watch for bears, mountain lions, venomous snakes, unstable terrain, flash flood zones, and poisonous plants. It's just basic preparation. That sounds like a list of things that would require a military expedition to safely encounter, the Vorthan observed. Nah, that's just a typical weekend. Kids do that stuff. We have summer camps specifically designed to teach children how to handle those environments. Instructor Vexai's hide had shifted to a color that wasn't in Marcus's cultural database, which suggested she was experiencing emotions that most species didn't have words for. Let me understand this correctly, she said slowly. Your species regularly sends children into environments containing apex predators and venomous creatures as a recreational activity? Well, yeah. How else would they learn? Besides, most of the dangerous stuff tries to avoid humans anyway. We're loud, we travel in groups, and we have a reputation for being unreasonably persistent if something bothers us. Most predators have figured out that it's easier to just leave us alone. The briefing room had gone completely quiet except for the alarm klaxons and the sound of several species quietly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about the galaxy. Instructor Vexai cleared her throat and attempted to regain control of the situation. Regardless of your background, the fact remains that you will be facing 17 species of apex predators in an environment specifically designed to test your survival skills to their absolute limits. The mortality rate for this scenario is 70%, and that's with full preparation and optimal conditions. Marcus nodded agreeably. That sounds reasonable. So what's the objective? Are we supposed to evade them, eliminate them, or establish peaceful contact? Because the approach is different depending on what we're trying to accomplish. The objective is to survive for 72 hours while maintaining communication with base camp and documenting your encounters for future training purposes. Oh, so it's basically a wildlife observation mission with self-defense protocols. That's not too bad. Do we have any restrictions on our methods? Or is it open season on creative problem solving? Vexai consulted her notes, though at this point she was beginning to suspect that no amount of preparation would adequately prepare her for whatever the human was about to suggest. Standard survival protocols apply. You are expected to use your training, your equipment, and your natural abilities to survive. Excessive use of technology is discouraged as it defeats the purpose of the exercise. Define excessive. No orbital bombardment, no planet-cracking weapons, no time manipulation devices, and no calling for military support. Marcus looked disappointed. What about terraforming equipment? What about it? Can we use it? For what purpose? Well, if you're going to be somewhere for 72 hours, you might as well make yourself comfortable. Plus, most predators don't like environmental changes. If you start rearranging their habitat, they'll usually relocate to somewhere more stable. The other trainees were staring at Marcus with the kind of expression typically reserved for watching someone casually discuss plans to juggle antimatter. You want to terraform a planet to avoid predators? The Karath asked weakly. Not the whole planet, just the local area. Maybe a few square miles. Nothing major. Just enough to disrupt their territorial patterns and create some safe zones. Instructor Vexhai rubbed her temples in a gesture that was apparently universal among frustrated educators. Trainee Chun, terraforming equipment is not standard survival gear. All right, I forgot that's not normal for most species. Okay, what about just basic construction equipment? Can we build fortifications? With what materials? Whatever's available locally. Most planets have decent mineral compositions for basic construction. You just need to know what to look for. How? Asked the Vorthin in a voice filled with scientific curiosity. Do you plan to perform geological surveys, mineral extraction, refinement, and construction in a survival scenario while being hunted by apex predators? Marcus shrugged. Multitasking. Besides, most predators won't bother you if you're making a lot of noise and obviously working on something. They prefer prey that's either hiding or running. If you're loudly building a fort, they'll usually assume you're either too dangerous to mess with or too crazy to be worth the effort. That, said the Zephyrian slowly, is the most insane survival strategy one have ever heard. Really? That's pretty basic stuff where I come from. Wait until I tell you about aggressive befriending. Aggressive befriending? Yeah, it's when you encounter a potentially dangerous creature and, instead of running or fighting, you just start trying to make friends with it. Most predators are so confused by the whole thing that they don't know how to react. Plus, if you can establish a positive relationship, they'll sometimes help you deal with other threats in the area. The room was silent except for the sound of several alien species quietly having existential crises. Instructor Vexhai stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. Her hide had settled into a shade that Marcus's database identified as resigned acceptance of incomprehensible circumstances. Trainees, she announced, we will be departing for Kepler 438b in 30 minutes. Please conduct final equipment checks and prepare for deployment. Trainee Chun, please remain behind for additional briefing. As the other trainees filed out of the room, their conversations a mixture of frightened whispers and awed speculation. Instructor Vexhai approached Marcus with the expression of someone who was about to ask a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Trainee Chun, she said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Sure thing. In your professional opinion, as someone who apparently grew up in an environment that makes our level 7 death worlds look like vacation resorts, what is the actual survival rate going to be for this mission? Marcus considered the question seriously. Well, that depends. Are we talking about just staying alive, or are we talking about completing the mission with full documentation and maintaining communication with base camp? Both. For staying alive? Pretty much 100%, assuming everyone follows basic safety protocols and doesn't do anything unnecessarily stupid. Vexhai blinked. And for completing the mission? Also pretty much 100%. I mean, documenting wildlife behavior is pretty straightforward, and maintaining communication is just a matter of keeping your equipment clean and dry and establishing regular check-in schedules. Trainee Chun, Vexhai said slowly, you do understand that this is considered one of the most dangerous training exercises in the known galaxy? Marcus nodded. Yeah, I get that. But I think there might be a disconnect between what most species consider dangerous and what humans consider dangerous. It's not that you guys are wrong. It's just that you're working with different baseline assumptions. What do you mean? Well, most species evolve in environments where they could afford to be specialized. You developed in worlds where you could focus on one particular ecological niche and become really good at it. Humans evolved in an environment where everything was trying to kill us all the time. So we had to become really good at everything just to survive long enough to reproduce. And you think that gives you an advantage in this scenario? Marcus shrugged. I think it gives me a different perspective on what constitutes a threat. What you guys are calling a level 7 survival scenario, I'm looking at, and thinking this is like camping but with better equipment and fewer mosquitoes. Instructor Vexai stared at him for a long moment, then made a note on her datapad that would eventually become part of a classified report that would fundamentally change how the Galactic Council thought about human integration into interstellar society. Trainee Chun, she said finally, I want you to understand that your classmates are genuinely terrified of what they're about to face. For them, this represents the absolute limit of what they believe they can survive. I get that, and I'm not trying to minimize their fear. Fear is a useful survival tool, but maybe instead of being scared of the predators, they should be thinking about how to turn the situation to their advantage. How would you suggest they do that? Marcus grinned, and for the first time since this conversation had started, Instructor Vexai began to understand why the rest of the galaxy was starting to develop a healthy respect for humans that bordered on existential terror. Easy, Marcus said. They should stick close to me and take notes. By the time we're done, they'll have enough field experience to teach their own survival courses. The alarm klaxons continued to sound as they made their way to the transport bay, but somehow they seemed less urgent now, almost cheerful, like they were announcing the start of an adventure rather than a potential catastrophe. Instructor Vexai made another note on her datapad. This one would eventually become the opening line of a research proposal that would lead to humans being classified as a beneficial anomaly in galactic survival statistics. The note read, human survival strategies appear to be based on the assumption that everything is already trying to kill them, and therefore any situation short of active planetary extinction represents an improvement in their living conditions. As they reached the transport bay, Marcus turned to her with the expression of someone who had just remembered something important. Oh, by the way, he said casually, I should probably mention that I used to work for the Park Service back on Earth. So I've got some experience with wildlife management and predator behavior modification. Wildlife management. Yeah, monitoring animal populations, managing tourist interactions, occasionally having to relocate or rehabilitate dangerous animals that were getting too comfortable around humans. Vexai stopped walking. Trainee Chun, what exactly did your job involve? Marcus scratched his head thoughtfully. Well, mostly I help people understand how to coexist safely with the local wildlife. Bears, mountain lions, wolves, sometimes the occasional escaped exotic animal from private collectors. Nothing too crazy. You dealt with escaped exotic animals? Oh yeah, that happens more often than you'd think. Rich people collect all sorts of weird stuff, and sometimes their security isn't as good as they think it is. Last year, I had to help relocate a Siberian tiger that had taken up residence in someone's backyard. Nice animal, just confused about territory boundaries. Instructor Vexai closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them again, Marcus was standing there with the patient expression of someone waiting for further instructions. Trainee Chun, she said carefully, when you say you helped relocate a Siberian tiger, what exactly does that process involve? Well, first you have to understand why it's where it shouldn't be, then you figure out what it actually needs, then you guide it toward a better location that meets those needs. Most of the time, they're just looking for food, water, or a quiet place to rest. Once you address those basic requirements, they're usually pretty cooperative about moving somewhere more appropriate. And if they're not cooperative, Marcus shrugged. Then you have to get creative. But most animals are reasonable if you approach them correctly. As they boarded the transport that would take them to what the rest of the galaxy considered one of the most dangerous places in known space, Instructor Vexai found herself wondering if perhaps it was time to revise the entire classification system for death worlds. After all, if the humans were right about their baseline assumptions, then most of what the galaxy considered unsurvivable might just be a matter of perspective. The transport engines hummed to life, and Marcus settled into his seat with the relaxed posture of someone embarking on a routine business trip. Around him, his fellow trainees displayed varying degrees of controlled panic and desperate preparation. Marcus pulled out a datapad and began reviewing the mission briefing materials with the focused attention of a professional preparing for another day at the office, which, from his perspective, was exactly what this was. The transport shuddered as it entered Kepler, 438b's atmosphere, and Marcus looked up from his datapad to observe his fellow trainees' reactions to their first glimpse of what the Galactic Survival Institute considered a maximum threat environment. Through the reinforced viewing ports, the planet below looked deceptively peaceful. Rolling hills covered in purple vegetation stretched toward distant mountain ranges, while silver streams meandered through valleys dotted with what appeared to be crystalline formations. The sky was a soft amber color, and twin moons hung visible in the daylight, casting overlapping shadows that created intricate patterns across the landscape. "It's beautiful," whispered the Vorthin, their crystalline form shifting to appreciative blues and greens. "Beautiful things are often the most dangerous," muttered the Karath, their mandibles clicking in nervous rhythm. Marcus nodded agreeably. "Yeah, that's pretty standard for death worlds. The really dangerous places usually look amazing because all the local life forms have evolved to be either incredibly efficient predators or incredibly effective at avoiding incredibly efficient predators. Either way, you end up with an ecosystem that's optimized for survival, which tends to produce some spectacular scenery." The Zephyrian looked up from their prayer ritual. "You speak as if you have experience with multiple death worlds." "Well, Earth qualifies, obviously, and I've done some consulting work on a few others. Vacation planets, mostly, places where wealthy folks want to build resorts, but need someone to explain why the local wildlife keeps eating their guests." Instructor Vex High, who had been monitoring their descent trajectory, turned to stare at Marcus. "You've worked as a consultant on death worlds? Freelance wildlife management. It pays pretty well, and most of the problems are pretty straightforward once you understand the underlying behavioral patterns. Rich tourists tend to make the same mistakes regardless of which planet they're on." "What kind of mistakes?" asked the Vorthin with scientific curiosity. "Mostly they assume that expensive equipment can substitute for common sense. They'll spend a fortune on personal defense systems, but then ignore basic safety protocols like checking wind direction before setting up camp downwind from a feeding ground, or wearing bright colors in territory claimed by something that interprets bright colors as a mating display or territorial challenge." The transport's pilot announced their final approach, and everyone except Marcus began performing what appeared to be last-minute rituals appropriate to their species. The Karath was organizing their equipment with obsessive precision. The Vorthin had shifted to a deep purple that indicated intense concentration. The Zephyrian was reviewing emergency protocols while muttering what sounded like a combination of prayers and tactical plans. Marcus finished reading the mission briefing and made a few notes on his datapad. Then he pulled out a small device that looked like a cross between a telescope and a sensor array and began scanning the landscape below. "What is that?" asked Instructor Vex High. "Portable Wildlife Scanner. It's designed to identify heat signatures, movement patterns, territorial markings, and basic behavioral indicators for unknown species. I built it myself based on some military surplus sensors and civilian research equipment." "You built your own scanning equipment?" "Yeah. The commercial stuff is usually optimized for specific environments or species types. This one's more flexible. See, look at this." Marcus showed her the display, which was showing a complex overlay of data points, heat signatures, and movement patterns across the landscape below. Those red indicators are large predators, probably the primary apex species mentioned in the briefing. The yellow ones are medium-sized threats, likely pack hunters or ambush predators. The green ones are herbivores or neutral species that might serve as early warning systems. And the blue ones? Those are interesting. They're showing up as high intelligence, complex social structure, but low immediate threat level. Could be tool users, could be hive minds, could be something we haven't encountered before. We'll want to observe those carefully. The transport settled onto the designated landing zone with a slight bump, and the pilot announced that they had 30 minutes to disembark and establish their initial base camp before transport departure. As the cargo bay doors opened, Marcus was struck by the complexity of scents carried on the planet's atmosphere. There was the ozone tang of electrical activity, the rich earthiness of decomposing vegetation, the sharp metallic scent of the crystalline formations, and underneath it all, the unmistakable musk of large predators marking territory. Wow, he said appreciatively. This place has really active biochemistry. You can smell the predator hierarchies from here. His fellow trainees looked alarmed. What do you mean by predator hierarchies? Asked the Zephyrian. Well, different predators leave different scent markers, and the way those markers overlap tells you a lot about who's dominant in the local ecosystem and how territories are established. Based on what I'm smelling, there are at least 4 distinct apex predators operating in this immediate area, but they're not in direct competition with each other. That suggests either temporal separation. They hunt at different times, or spatial separation. They've divided up the territory based on preferred hunting grounds. Is that good or bad? Asked the Karath. It's information. Whether it's good or bad depends on what we do with it. Marcus shouldered his pack and stepped off the transport. The ground beneath his feet was spongy, covered with what appeared to be a moss-like plant that released small puffs of luminescent spores when disturbed. The spores drifted upward in slow, hypnotic spirals before dissolving in the amber sunlight. Pretty, observed the Vorthan, watching the light show. And functional, added Marcus. Those spores are probably a communication mechanism. We just announced our presence to everything in the area. The other trainees suddenly looked much less appreciative of the beautiful light display. Announced our presence how? Asked Instructor Vex High. Well, the spores are responding to pressure and movement patterns. Different gaits, different weights, different numbers of individuals, they're all going to produce different spore signatures. Any predator in the area that's learned to read those signals now knows that 5 medium-sized organisms of at least 3 different species just entered the territory. As if to confirm his words, a distant howling sound echoed across the landscape. It was answered by a second howl from a different direction, then a third, then a sound that was less howling and more like the screech of grinding metal. They're coordinating, Marcus noted with interest. That's good. It means they're intelligent enough to be reasoned with if necessary. Reasoned with? The Zephyrian's voice had gone up about 2 octaves. Well, sure. Most intelligent predators are capable of cost-benefit analysis. If you can demonstrate that you're more trouble than you're worth, or if you can offer them something they value more than eating you, they're usually willing to negotiate. The transport's engines began spinning up for departure, and the pilot's voice came over their comm units. Base camp establishment window begins now. You have 72 hours to complete your mission objectives. Emergency extraction is available only for Category 1 medical emergencies or mission-critical equipment failure. Good luck. As the transport lifted off and disappeared into the amber sky, the 5 trainees found themselves alone on a death world with 17 species of apex predators and a human who apparently thought this was a reasonable situation for conducting diplomatic negotiations. Right, said Marcus, consulting his scanner and making notes. First things first, we need to establish a base camp that takes advantage of the local geography while minimizing our vulnerability to the primary threat vectors. Based on the terrain analysis, I'd suggest that cluster of crystalline formations about half a kilometer northwest. They're elevated enough to provide good sight lines. The crystals themselves might interfere with certain types of predator senses, and the formation creates multiple escape routes if we need them. How do you know the crystals will interfere with predator senses? Asked the Vorthan. I don't know for sure, but most crystalline formations generate some kind of electromagnetic field, and a lot of predators rely on bioelectric sensing to track prey. Even if it doesn't completely mask us, it might make us harder to pinpoint precisely. Marcus started walking toward the formations, scanning continuously and making notes. The others followed, though their formation suggested they were expecting attack at any moment. Relax, Marcus called back to them. We're not exhibiting prey behavior, so most predators are going to observe us before they commit to any kind of engagement. Think of it like a job interview. They're trying to figure out if we're worth the effort. Job interview? Asked the Karath. Yeah, predators are basically running cost-benefit analysis on everything they encounter. Is this potential prey easy enough to kill that the energy expenditure is justified by the caloric intake? Does this potential prey have defensive capabilities that might result in injury? Is this potential prey part of a larger group that might retaliate? Are there easier targets available in the immediate area? As they walked, Marcus continued his commentary. Right now, we're walking in a confident, organized formation. We're obviously well-equipped, we're communicating regularly, and we're heading toward defensible terrain. From a predator's perspective, we're exhibiting pack behavior typical of a species that's capable of fighting back effectively. Most intelligent predators are going to want more information before they decide whether to engage. They reached the crystalline formations without incident, though Marcus's scanner was showing increasing activity in the surrounding area. The formations were even more impressive up close, translucent spires that rose from the ground like frozen lightning, creating a maze of reflecting surfaces and acoustic shadows. Okay, Marcus announced, this is perfect. The acoustic properties mean we'll hear anything approaching from a long distance. The reflective surfaces will make it difficult for visually oriented predators to get an accurate fix on our exact location, and the electromagnetic field generated by the crystals is definitely strong enough to interfere with bioelectric sensors. He began unpacking his equipment with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Vorthan, I need you to take readings on the electromagnetic field strength and frequency. Karath, your species has excellent hearing, so I want you to establish an audio perimeter and start cataloging the sound signatures of local wildlife. Zephyrian, you're our communications specialist, so set up our base camp beacon and establish contact schedules with the Institute. What about me? Asked Instructor Vexhai. You're the senior member of this expedition, so you're in charge of tactical planning and mission documentation. I'll handle predator monitoring and environmental adaptation. As the team began setting up their base camp, Marcus continued scanning the surrounding area and taking notes. The wildlife activity was increasing as local species began investigating the newcomers, but the pattern of movement suggested curiosity rather than immediate aggression. Interesting, he murmured, studying his scanner readings. What? Asked Vexhai, looking up from her tactical planning. The local predators are exhibiting reconnaissance behavior rather than hunting behavior. They're gathering information about us, but they're not positioning themselves for attack. That suggests they're intelligent enough to understand that we might be something they haven't encountered before. Is that good? It's fascinating. Most predators have pretty rigid behavioral patterns based on millions of years of evolution. When they encounter something that doesn't fit those patterns, they have to fall back on learning and adaptation rather than instinct. That means we're dealing with species that are not only intelligent, but flexible enough to modify their behavior based on new information. A new sound echoed across the landscape, a deep, resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was answered by similar calls from multiple directions, creating a complex harmony that reverberated through the crystalline formations. They're talking about us, Marcus said with obvious delight. How can you tell? Asked the Karath, their mandibles clicking nervously. The call and response pattern is too complex to be simple territorial marking. They're sharing information, probably observations about our behavior, equipment, and capabilities. It's like they're holding a conference call to discuss the new arrivals. The Vorthan looked up from their electromagnetic readings. Is this normal behavior for predatory species? Not for most predators, no. This level of coordination and information sharing is usually only seen in species with advanced social structures, which means we're not just dealing with individual hunters. We're dealing with a collective intelligence. That sounds terrifying, observed the Zephyrian. Actually, it's encouraging, Marcus replied. Individual predators operate on instinct and immediate self-interest. Collective intelligences are capable of long-term thinking and strategic planning. That means they're more likely to be interested in sustainable interactions rather than immediate consumption. As if to emphasize his point, the calls suddenly changed pattern. Instead of the complex harmonies they had been hearing, the sounds became simpler, more rhythmic, and seemed to be coming from specific directions rather than everywhere at once. They're trying to communicate, Marcus said, his excitement obvious. The pattern change indicates intentional signal modification designed to convey specific information to an unknown recipient. You think they're trying to talk to us? I think they're trying to establish whether we're capable of communication. This is incredible. We're witnessing first contact protocols from an indigenous predatory intelligence. Marcus began adjusting his scanner to record the audio patterns and analyze them for linguistic structure. If I'm right about this, we're about to make one of the most significant discoveries in xenobiological history. And if you're wrong, asked Instructor Vex High. Marcus shrugged. Then, we're about to be eaten by some very well-organized predators. But either way, it's going to be educational. As the sun began to set, the amber sky deepened to a rich gold that painted the crystalline formations in warm, honey-colored light. The calls from the surrounding predators had evolved into something that definitely resembled a structured conversation, with distinct voices asking and answering questions in patterns that suggested actual information exchange. I hate to admit this, said Instructor Vexhai quietly, but you might be right about the communication hypothesis. Those sound patterns are showing mathematical relationships that are too complex to be coincidental. Marcus nodded, still recording and analyzing. The question now is whether they're just discussing us, or whether they're trying to establish communication protocols. If it's the latter, we might be about to participate in the first interspecies diplomatic contact with a predatory collective intelligence. And if it's the former, then we're about to find out how well our defensive preparations work against coordinated attack by multiple apex predators with advanced tactical planning capabilities. As darkness fell and the twin moons rose, casting overlapping shadows that turned the landscape into a maze of silver light and deep shadow, the sound patterns from the surrounding predators shifted again. This time, they were clearly coming from multiple locations in a pattern that suggested the creatures were positioning themselves around the base camp. Here we go, Marcus said cheerfully, checking his equipment one final time. Whatever happens next, it's going to be interesting. In the distance, something large moved through the purple vegetation, its passage marked by the soft luminescence of disturbed spores rising like stars against the darkening sky. The real test was about to begin. The first predator emerged from the purple vegetation just as the twin moons reached their zenith. Marcus had been tracking its approach for the better part of an hour, watching heat signatures and movement patterns on a scanner while his teammates maintained various states of controlled panic. What stepped into the moonlight was unlike anything in the Galactic Survival Institute's databases. The creature stood roughly 3 meters tall at the shoulder, with a build that suggested both power and agility. Its height appeared to be a living crystal matrix that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury while maintaining structural integrity. 6 legs supported a body that moved with the fluid grace of a large cat, but the head was distinctly reptilian, with forward-facing eyes that reflected the moonlight like polished gems. "Beautiful," whispered Marcus, adjusting his scanner to record detailed biometric data. "Beautiful," hissed the Karath. "That thing could tear us apart without effort." "Well, sure, but look at the evolutionary adaptations. The crystalline hide probably provides both protection and camouflage. It can match the local formations during daylight and become nearly invisible in moonlight. The leg configuration suggests it's equally comfortable on rough terrain or smooth surfaces. And those eyes are definitely adapted for low-light hunting with exceptional depth perception." The creature stopped about 50 meters from their camp and sat back on its haunches in a posture that was unmistakably deliberate. It was clearly observing them, but its body language suggested curiosity rather than immediate predatory intent. "It's waiting for something," observed the Vorthan, their crystalline form shifting to nervous orange. "It's waiting for us to do something," Marcus corrected. "This is a test. It wants to see how we respond to its presence." "How can you possibly know that?" demanded Instructor Vex High. "Body language. If it wanted to attack, it would be in a different position. Weight forward, muscles tensed, head lowered. If it was just passing through, it wouldn't have stopped and oriented itself directly toward us. This is a deliberate presentation. It wants our attention. Marcus stood up slowly and moved to the edge of their camp perimeter, his hands visible and empty of weapons. The creature's eyes tracked his movement, but showed no signs of alarm. "What are you doing?" the Zephyrian whispered urgently. "Establishing communication protocols," Marcus replied quietly. "If this is an intelligent species, then first contact should follow diplomatic rather than military procedures." He raised one hand in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peaceful intent, then slowly pointed to himself, then to the creature, then made a gesture that could be interpreted as an invitation. The creature tilted its head, a movement that was remarkably similar to the questioning gesture of terrestrial mammals. Then it raised one of its forelimbs and pointed at Marcus, then at itself, then made a complex gesture with multiple appendages that Marcus couldn't interpret. "It's responding," Marcus said with barely contained excitement. It understood the basic structure of the communication attempt and responded with its own version. Or, suggested the Karath, "it's mimicking your behavior as a prelude to attack." Possible but unlikely. Mimicry for predatory purposes is usually much more precise. This feels more like Marcus was interrupted by the arrival of the second predator. This one was completely different from the first, roughly humanoid in basic structure, but with proportions that suggested it was designed for speed rather than power. Its skin appeared to be made of the same purple vegetation that covered the planet, complete with the luminescent spores that drifted away from its body as it moved. When it stopped beside the first creature, the two began producing the complex harmonic calls they had been hearing all evening. "They're discussing us," Marcus said, listening intently to the patterns. The frequency modulations suggest they're sharing observational data. A third predator emerged from a different direction. This one defied easy description. It appeared to be composed primarily of shadow and starlight, with a form that seemed to shift and flow like liquid darkness punctuated by points of brilliant silver light. When it moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around it, creating optical effects that made it difficult to look at directly. "Okay," said Marcus thoughtfully, "that's definitely not carbon-based." "What is it?" asked the Vorthan, their sensors apparently unable to get clear readings. "Energy-based life form, probably. Or possibly something that exists partially in our dimension and partially in some other spatial configuration. Either way, it's fascinating." The three creatures arranged themselves in a rough triangle around the human camp, but maintained their previous distance. The harmonic calls continued, but now they included new frequencies that seemed to come from the shadow creature. "They're including the newcomer in their discussion," Marcus observed. "That suggests a social structure based on information sharing rather than rigid hierarchy." More creatures began emerging from the surrounding landscape. Marcus counted at least 7 distinct species, each radically different from the others. There was something that looked like a living tree, with too many joints, a creature that appeared to be made of flowing water held together by surface tension, something that might have been a geometric impossibility rendered in flesh and bone, and several others that challenged his ability to describe them in conventional terms. "We're looking at a collective," Marcus said with awe. "Not just multiple species, but multiple categories of life forms working together as an integrated system." "Working together to do what?" asked Instructor Vexhai, though she was fairly certain she didn't want to hear the answer. "That's what we're about to find out." The harmonic calls reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, one of the creatures, the original crystalline predator, began approaching their camp slowly and deliberately. "Nobody move," Marcus said quietly. "This is either first contact or last contact, and our reaction is going to determine which." The creature stopped just outside their perimeter and began producing a new type of sound. Not the harmonic calls they had been hearing, but something that sounded almost like speech. The tones were complex and musical, but there was an underlying structure that suggested language. Marcus listened carefully, then attempted to reproduce one of the simpler sound patterns. His attempt was obviously crude, but the creature's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. It repeated the sound back to him with what appeared to be corrections to his pronunciation. Language lessons, Marcus said with a grin. They're trying to teach us how to talk to them. For the next hour, Marcus engaged in the galaxy's first xenolinguistic lesson with a collective of apex predators. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but gradually patterns began to emerge. The creature's language appeared to be based on harmonic combinations rather than sequential sounds, which explained the complex musical quality of their communications. Eventually, Marcus managed to produce a sound pattern that caused visible excitement among the creatures. They began responding with increasingly complex vocalizations, and gradually he began to understand that they were trying to convey specific concepts. I think, he said slowly, they're trying to tell us something about their planet. What kind of something? Asked the Zephyrian. Marcus listened to another series of harmonic calls, then attempted a response. The creature's reaction suggested he was at least partially correct in his interpretation. They're saying that this planet is not what we think it is, Marcus said. It's not a death world or a predator preserve. It's something else entirely. What else could it be? Marcus listened to more vocalizations, asked his own questions in the primitive version of their language he was beginning to understand, and gradually pieced together a picture that was far more complex than anything in their mission briefing. It's a school, he said finally. This entire planet is an educational facility. A school for what? Asked Instructor Vex-High. For teaching interspecies cooperation and communication. All these different life forms, they're not native predators. They're students, just like us. The revelation hit the team with the force of a physical blow. Everything they had assumed about their situation was wrong. They weren't struggling to survive on a death world populated by apex predators. They were participating in the galaxy's most advanced course in xenobiology and interspecies relations. But the danger ratings protested the Karath, the mortality statistics, the Level 7 classification. Marcus continued his conversation with the creatures, gradually learning more about the true nature of their situation. The danger is real, he said after several minutes of halting communication. But it's not arbitrary. The mortality rate reflects the fact that most species aren't ready for this level of interspecies contact. The predator classification exists because fear and survival pressure create optimal learning conditions for developing communication skills with radically different life forms. So, the Institute has been sending students here to die. No, they've been sending students here to learn. The ones who die are the ones who can adapt their thinking fast enough to realize that their assumptions about the situation are wrong. The ones who survive are the ones who figure out that cooperation is more effective than competition when dealing with unknown variables. The crystalline creature that had been serving as their primary communication partner began producing new sounds, and Marcus realized it was introducing the other members of its collective. As each creature was introduced, it demonstrated some aspect of its unique capabilities. The tree-like being showed its ability to process and purify atmosphere. The water creature demonstrated environmental sensing capabilities that far exceeded any technology. The shadow being displayed what appeared to be limited reality manipulation abilities. They're not just students, Marcus said with growing excitement. They're teachers. Each species brings unique capabilities and perspectives to the collective. The educational model is based on mutual instruction rather than traditional classroom learning. What are they trying to teach us? Asked the Vorthan. Marcus spent several more minutes in conversation with the collective, gradually understanding the scope and purpose of their educational program. Everything, he said finally, xenobiology, environmental adaptation, communication theory, collective problem solving, resource management, conflict resolution, and probably a dozen other subjects that we don't have names for yet. And were we supposed to teach them? Marcus listened to another exchange, then turned to his teammates with an expression of profound respect for the sophistication of the educational system they had stumbled into. Human survival strategies, he said. They want to understand how a single species can be so adaptable that it can function effectively in virtually any environment. They've been studying Earth for decades, trying to figure out what makes humans so remarkably versatile. They've been studying Earth. Of course they have. Think about it. We're the only known species that can survive and thrive on a Class 12 death world. From their perspective, we represent the ultimate evolutionary success story. They want to understand how human adaptability works so they can incorporate those principles into their own survival strategies. The conversation continued through the night as Marcus gradually learned the basics of the collective's educational philosophy. The program was designed to take representatives from various species and immerse them in challenging environments that force them to develop new ways of thinking about cooperation, communication, and survival. The predatory classification was deliberately maintained to ensure that incoming students experienced genuine survival pressure, which accelerated the learning process and eliminated individuals who couldn't adapt quickly enough to be effective in truly dangerous interspecies situations. So essentially, Instructor Vexhai said slowly, "This is graduate-level education disguised as a survival scenario." "More than that," Marcus replied. "This is preparation for real interspecies contact situations. Everything we're learning here, communication with radically different life forms, cooperation under pressure, resource management in hostile environments, collective problem-solving with diverse capabilities, these are exactly the skills needed for successful exploration and colonization of unknown worlds." As dawn approached and the amber sky began to lighten, the collective began demonstrating their integrated capabilities. Working together, they transformed a section of the surrounding landscape, turning barren ground into a thriving microecosystem that incorporated elements from each of their biological and technological capabilities. They're showing us what's possible when species with complementary capabilities learn to work together effectively, Marcus observed. This isn't just about survival. It's about creating something greater than the sum of its parts. The demonstration was impressive, but Marcus was more intrigued by the underlying principles. Each species contributed their unique strengths to the collective effort, but the real power came from their ability to coordinate and integrate their efforts seamlessly. "How long," asked the Zephyrian, "does this education program typically last?" Marcus relayed the question and listened to the response. "It varies depending on the students and the complexity of the challenges they choose to take on. Some basic certification programs can be completed in a few weeks. Advanced programs can take years. But the real education never stops. They're continuously encountering new species and new challenges, so they're always learning and adapting." And what happens to students who complete the program? They become teachers and ambassadors. They return to their home species with the knowledge and skills needed to facilitate peaceful contact with other intelligent life forms. They become the foundation for truly effective interstellar civilization. As the sun rose fully and the landscape transformed from shadow and moonlight to the warm amber glow of full daylight, Marcus realized that everything he had thought he knew about galactic civilization was wrong. The Institute wasn't just training survival specialists. They were inadvertently participating in a much larger educational program designed to prepare various species for the challenges of true interstellar cooperation. "So what happens now?" asked Instructor Vexhai. Marcus posed the question to the collective and listened to their response. Then, he turned back to his teammates with a grin that suggested he was about to make an offer that would change their lives forever. "Now," he said, "we get to decide whether we want to complete our original 72-hour survival mission and return to the Institute with a standard mission report, or whether we want to stay here and participate in the most advanced xenobiological education program in the known galaxy. And if we choose to stay, then we become part of something that's going to reshape how the entire galaxy thinks about interspecies relations. We become pioneers in a new kind of civilization based on cooperation rather than competition." The collective waited patiently while the human team discussed their options. But looking around at the incredible diversity of life forms that had somehow learned to work together as an integrated unit, and considering the possibilities that kind of cooperation might create on a galactic scale, Marcus was fairly certain he already knew what their decision was going to be. After all, this was exactly the kind of opportunity that humans specialized in recognizing and seizing. The decision to stay wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. After 3 hours of discussion, debate, and consultation with the collective, 4 of the 5 team members chose to extend their mission indefinitely. The Karath, citing family obligations and cultural restrictions on long-term off-world assignments, opted to return with a scheduled extraction transport. I understand, Marcus assured them as they prepared their departure message. This isn't the kind of decision you make lightly, and it's not for everyone. But could you do us a favor when you get back to the Institute? What kind of favor? The Karath asked, their mandibles clicking in the pattern Marcus had learned indicated thoughtful consideration. Don't tell them what we've really found here. Not yet. Give us some time to learn more about how this system works before the Institute tries to turn it into a formal academic program. The Karath considered this, then nodded agreement. I will report that the human team has requested extended mission time for additional research, and that the threat level appears to have been overestimated. That should buy you at least several weeks before they begin asking detailed questions. As the Karath departed with the extraction transport, Marcus and the remaining team members began their real education. The collective, it turned out, had been waiting for decades for human participation in their program. Earth's reputation as an impossibly dangerous world populated by an impossibly adaptable species had made humans something of a legend among the galaxy's survival specialists. The fascinating thing explained the entity that Marcus had begun thinking of as the coordinator, a collective consciousness that seemed to emerge from the interactions between the various species rather than existing in any single individual, is that humans appear to have developed survival strategies that work regardless of environmental conditions. Most species optimize for specific ecological niches. Humans optimize for change itself. The conversation was taking place in the expanded base camp that the collective had helped them construct. It was unlike anything in conventional military or scientific architecture, a series of interconnected spaces that incorporated the environmental requirements of multiple species while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to changing conditions. How do you mean? Asked instructor Vexhai, who had officially redesignated herself as research team leader in her communications with the Institute. The coordinator's response came through the harmonized vocalizations of several collective members, translated into concepts that human language could approximate. Most species develop specialized survival strategies. Aquatic species become extremely efficient in water, but struggle on land. High-gravity species become incredibly strong, but have difficulty in low-gravity environments. Humans seem to have developed meta-survival strategies, approaches that allow them to quickly develop new specialized capabilities for whatever environment they encounter. You mean adaptability itself is our survival trait? Asked the Vorthan. More than adaptability. Humans appear to have evolved what we might call survival pattern recognition. You can observe a new environment, identify the primary challenges, and develop effective responses faster than most species can even understand what they're looking at. Marcus considered this. I think it's because we evolved in an environment that kept changing the rules. Earth's climate has been unstable for millions of years. Ice ages, volcanic periods, asteroid impacts, ecological collapses, and recovery cycles. Any species that survived had to be able to handle radical environmental changes on relatively short timescales. Which explains, added the coordinator, why humans are the first species we've encountered that can function effectively in collective environments with radically different life forms. You're already adapted to constant change, so incorporating new variables into your survival calculations is natural rather than stressful. Over the following days, Marcus and his team began participating in increasingly complex exercises designed to test and develop their ability to work with non-human intelligences. The challenges were unlike anything they had encountered in conventional training. Scenarios that required them to coordinate with species that communicated through color changes, operated on completely different temporal scales, or existed partially outside normal space-time. The key insight, Marcus explained to his teammates after a particularly challenging exercise involving resource management with a silicon-based collective consciousness, is that every species has developed solutions to problems that other species don't even recognize as problems. The real educational value isn't learning how to survive in alien environments. It's learning how to recognize and incorporate alien problem-solving approaches. The exercise in question had involved managing water resources for a diverse community during a simulated drought. The Silicon-based collective had solved the problem by restructuring the local geology to create an underground reservoir system, while the plant-based entities had modified their own biology to extract moisture from atmospheric humidity. The energy-based life forms had contributed by manipulating weather patterns on a microscopic scale to increase local precipitation. None of those solutions would have occurred to us, observed the Vorthan, because they're all based on capabilities that carbon-based life forms don't naturally possess. Exactly, Marcus replied. But now that we've seen them work, we can start thinking about how to achieve similar results using human technologies and capabilities. It's like having access to millions of years of R&D from completely different evolutionary paths. The real breakthrough came during their second week when the collective introduced them to what they called integration protocols, formal procedures for establishing permanent cooperation between species with complementary capabilities. The process was far more complex than Marcus had initially realized. It wasn't just about learning to communicate or coordinate activities. True integration required each species to modify their basic survival and social patterns to accommodate the needs and capabilities of their partners. For humans, the coordinator explained, integration is relatively straightforward because your survival strategies are already based on environmental adaptation. For most other species, integration requires fundamental changes to behaviors that have been fixed for millions of years of evolution. Is that why the mortality rate is so high? Asked Instructor Vexhai. Partially. Species that can adapt their basic behavioral patterns quickly enough simply cannot survive in truly integrated environments. But mortality also results from misunderstanding the nature of the challenges involved. What do you mean? The coordinator's explanation came through a complex demonstration involving several collective members working together to solve a problem that would have been impossible for any single species. The problem was apparently simple: moving a large boulder that was blocking access to a water source. But the boulder was composed of material that was toxic to physical contact, was too heavy for conventional lifting, and was positioned in a way that made technological solutions impossible. The solution required the plant-based entities to modify the soil chemistry to neutralize the toxicity. The energy-based life forms to temporarily alter the boulder's molecular structure to reduce its mass. The crystalline entities to create a temporary bridge that avoided the need to move the boulder at all, and the shadow entity to manipulate local space-time to provide additional leverage for the lifting process. No single species could have solved that problem, the coordinator explained. But working together, it became trivial. The mortality rate is high because most species attempt to solve integration challenges using only their own capabilities. They fail to understand that the point of integration is to become something greater than the sum of the individual parts. And humans? Marcus asked. Humans instinctively understand that survival often requires using whatever tools and resources are available, regardless of whether those tools were originally designed for the task at hand. You call it improvisation, but it's actually a sophisticated form of systems thinking that most species take centuries to develop. As their education progressed, Marcus began to understand the true scope of what they were participating in. The collective on Kepler 438b was not unique. It was part of a network of similar educational facilities spread throughout the galaxy. Each facility specialized in different aspects of interspecies cooperation, and students typically rotated through multiple locations as their capabilities advanced. How many species are participating in this network? He asked during one of their evening briefings. Currently, 47 species across 12 different categories of biological organization, the coordinator replied. But the network is growing rapidly as more species achieve the technological and social development necessary for meaningful participation. What about species that never achieve that level of development? They continue to exist within their own ecological and technological niches. Integration is not mandatory, and many species prefer to maintain their traditional approaches to survival and development. The network exists to serve species that choose to pursue collective advancement. Marcus found this reassuring. One of his concerns about the integration process had been the possibility that it might lead to some kind of homogenization that eliminated the diversity that made different species valuable as partners in the first place. The goal, the coordinator confirmed, is not to make all species similar, but to create frameworks for cooperation that preserve and utilize the unique capabilities of each partner. Diversity is what makes integration valuable. Without significant differences in capabilities and perspectives, there would be no benefit to working together. During their third week, the human team was introduced to advanced integration protocols that required them to work with species from other facilities in network. These exercises were conducted in virtual environments that could simulate conditions from any known world, allowing them to practice cooperation under a wide variety of challenging circumstances. "This is incredible," breathed the Vorthin after completing a scenario that involved establishing a colony on a world where the local ecosystem was based on electromagnetic rather than chemical processes. "We're not just learning survival skills, we're learning how to become galactic citizens." "More than that," Marcus replied. "We're learning how to become galactic pioneers. Every exercise is preparing us for encounters with species and environments that haven't been discovered yet." The realization was both exciting and sobering. The network wasn't just an educational program. It was preparation for the next phase of galactic civilization. As space travel became easier and more species achieved interstellar capability, the ability to establish successful cooperation with unknown life forms was becoming essential for survival and advancement. Think about it, Marcus explained to his teammates. Right now, most interstellar contact is limited to species that are similar enough to understand each other without too much difficulty. But as we expand into new regions of the galaxy, we're going to encounter forms of life that are so different from anything we've seen before that conventional diplomacy won't work. We need people who can establish communication and cooperation with truly alien intelligences. And that's what this training is for. We're becoming the advanced scouts for true galactic civilization. As if to emphasize the point, their next exercise involved contact with a form of life that existed entirely as patterns of quantum fluctuation in what most species would consider empty space. Establishing communication required learning to think in terms of probability distributions rather than discrete events, and cooperation required developing technologies that could interface with quantum processes. 6 months ago, observed Instructor Vexhai after they had successfully completed the exercise, I would have said that was impossible. 6 months ago, Marcus replied with a grin, we thought a level 7 survival scenario was the most challenging thing we'd ever face. The conversation was interrupted by an alert from the communication system. A new message from the Galactic Survival Institute was requesting detailed mission reports and indicating that a formal review of their extended mission status would be conducted within 2 weeks. Marcus looked at the message, then at his teammates, then at the diverse collection of alien intelligences that had become their teachers and partners over the past month. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "I guess it's time to decide how we're going to explain this to the rest of the galaxy." The collective had been expecting this moment, and their response was characteristically thorough and sophisticated. Instead of simply providing information, they offered the human team a choice that would determine not just their own futures, but the future of human participation in galactic civilization. "We can facilitate your return to conventional civilization with reports that will satisfy your superiors," the coordinator explained. "Or we can help you begin the process of establishing formal diplomatic contact between the integration network and your governmental authorities." "What would formal diplomatic contact involve?" asked Instructor Vexhai. "It would mean revealing the existence of the network to your species and offering membership in the broader galactic community that exists beyond the current limited interstellar political structures. Marcus felt a familiar surge of excitement that he was beginning to associate with moments when a universe revealed itself to be far more interesting and complex than he had previously imagined. In other words, he said slowly, we get to be the first humans to participate in making first contact with a galactic civilization that most of our species doesn't even know exists. That's correct. But understand that this decision cannot be reversed. Once formal contact is established, your species will be committed to participating in the broader galactic community with all the opportunities and responsibilities that entails. Marcus looked at his teammates and saw his own excitement reflected in their faces. This was exactly the kind of opportunity that humans specialized in recognizing and seizing, a chance to leap forward into something completely unprecedented with nothing to guide them except their own adaptability and willingness to embrace the unknown. How long do we have to make this decision? He asked. As long as you need. But understand that the choice itself is part of your education. How you approach this decision will determine whether your species is ready for what comes next. As the twin moons rose and the amber sky deepened to gold, Marcus and his team began the most important discussion of their lives. They were about to decide whether humanity was ready to become a true galactic species. And based on everything he had learned about human adaptability and the galaxy's appreciation for that quality, Marcus was fairly confident he knew what their answer was going to be. The decision took 18 hours, 3 formal votes, and one moment of what Marcus would later describe as collective human enlightenment, when they all simultaneously realized that they were debating whether to make the most important choice in their species' history based on a sample size of 4 people on an alien world. You know what? Marcus had said during the 7th hour of discussion, when they were deep into analyzing the potential political ramifications of formal first contact. We're overthinking this. How can we be overthinking the decision that will determine humanity's role in galactic civilization? Demanded Instructor Vex High. Because we're assuming that our decision is what determines humanity's role in galactic civilization, Marcus replied. But that's not actually true. Humanity's role is going to be determined by how humans respond to the opportunities and challenges they encounter. All we're deciding is whether we're going to be the ones who provide them with that first opportunity. The Vorthan looked up from the detailed cost-benefit analysis they had been preparing. Could you elaborate? Well, think about it. The integration network has been around for thousands of years. They've been studying Earth for decades. They know humans exist, and they know what human capabilities are. Whether or not we make formal contact now, that contact is going to happen eventually. The only question is whether it happens through people who understand what they're getting into, or through people who are completely unprepared. You're saying the choice isn't whether to make contact, but whether to make informed contact. Exactly. And since humans are apparently really good at adaptation and improvisation, wouldn't it be better if our species' introduction to galactic civilization happened through people who have actually learned how galactic civilization works? The logic was undeniable, even if the implications were staggering. Besides, Marcus added with a grin that his teammates had learned usually preceded his most audacious suggestions. When has humanity ever turned down an opportunity to explore something completely unknown and potentially dangerous? Fair point, conceded Instructor Vex High. The formal announcement was made at dawn on their 30th day on Kepler 438b. Marcus stood before the assembled collective, his teammates beside him, and spoke words that would be recorded in the archives of 47 different species as the moment when humanity formally joined the galactic community. On behalf of our team, and with the understanding that we are probably exceeding our authority in spectacular fashion, we accept your invitation to establish formal diplomatic contact between humanity and the integration network. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The collective's harmonic celebration created sound patterns so complex that Marcus's translation software temporarily overloaded trying to process them. When the music finally subsided, The coordinator's response came through with an undertone of satisfaction that suggested this outcome had been anticipated. Welcome to galactic civilization, humanity. Your integration protocol begins now. What followed was the most intensive education any human had ever received. Over the next 6 months, Marcus and his team were rotated through 17 different facilities in the integration network, each specializing in different aspects of interspecies cooperation and galactic citizenship. They learned communication protocols for species that thought in mathematical equations rather than words. They studied resource management techniques developed by hive minds spanning multiple star systems. They practiced conflict resolution methods designed to work with cultures that had no concept of individual identity. They trained in technologies that operated on principles that human physics was only beginning to understand. It's like drinking from a fire hose. Observe the Vorthan during their rotation through a facility specializing in quantum-based life forms. Except the fire hose is connected to an ocean, and the ocean contains the accumulated knowledge of galactic